Hi folks. I'm going to start with a few short videos addressing the topic of photographic theory. And we just brushed on this at the beginning of class, and we determined that in order for photography to work, we needed to have light. And light energy was a form of actually electricity, and before the digital camera, those photons, those electrical charges, would react with the silver molecules in film and change them and create what we call a latent image. These days with digital photography, the electrical charges, the photons are being measured by millions of sensors, and those readings are turned into a digital stream which goes from the sensor to the processor. So we understand that unless you're doing infrared photography, which is a very small little splinter group where photographs are taken of heat waves and heat, but 99.9% of photographs are contingent upon light. And we've also talked about two dirty words in photography: overexposure and underexposure. And we have a goal in photography, which is to get just the right amount of light in, not to overwhelm the sensor or the film, and not to provide too little bit of electricity to create what we call a full-scale negative or a full-scale capture, which is essential for making a beautiful print. I want to go back to the beginning of photography and some of the frustrations that the early photographers had to face, and one of those was how to measure light. As they were developing their camera equipment, they were making apertures available to change the size of the lens opening. That was going to help them to create the depth of field and the focus that they wanted. But when it came to calculating how long to leave the lens cap off, and that was the early way of taking a picture, you set your camera up on a tripod, and then you removed the lens cap and the exposure started, and you had a pocket watch, and that pocket watch would help you determine hopefully what the right exposure was. And then you put the lens cap back on to stop the exposure, and that was your shutter speed, that was your time, usually measured in 15 seconds up to 2 minutes, depending on what kind of light. Well, over time, there was a rule that got developed, and it was called by two different names. And we're going to call it either the F16 rule, or we're going to call it BDE, standing for basic daylight exposure. So here's the rule. Start by drawing a triangle. You can do better than I did. And then let's put a sun symbol at the top, and we're going to signify that that is a bright sun. It's not a cloudy sun, it's a bright sun. In the middle, we're going to write F16 rule, or basic daylight exposure. Now, we have two questions when we go to set our camera. What shutter speed and what f-stop, or what aperture, what lens opening? Well, one of these is given to you, and that comes from f16. So over here we're going to write f16. So one of the mysteries is solved. All you have to do is remember, when you're using this rule to get good exposure, put f16 on your camera's lens. Now the other mystery is what the shutter speed should be. And the way to get that answer is to think about the ISO. And with film, you find that on the box. It'll say ISO 125 or ISO 400. And the digital camera, you're going to say you set the ISO at 200, or you set the ISO at 400. Okay, so if you know that ISO number, then you write it as a fraction. So it's 1 over the ISO of either the film or the ISO of the camera that you took off of auto ISO and you locked it down on a number like 200 or 400. So if I'm outdoors in bright sunlight and I set my aperture at f16, and then I remember that I'm using 200 speed film, I can say, okay, so 1 over the ISO is 1/200th of a second. So that's end of video 1. We'll pick up on this in a second.